Good afternoon, everyone. So it's my pleasant duty to welcome you all to this 26th talk in the series of talks called Member Enrichment Program by IFSA's Learning Garden group. So it's my pleasant duty to talk something about IFSA in this in welcoming you all. And in previous talks, you all must have already heard from many of the members and all about the activities of IFSA and all those things. And so you all know that this Indian Women Scientist Association was started way back in 1973 by a group of 12 dedicated women scientists. And their objectives were to take science to masses, work for the empowerment of women, means help women who are pursuing scientific research and other career, and also work for the societal benefits with our scientific knowledge. All of us who have some knowledge about implementing certain things, we can use it to the benefit of the society. So these are the noble objectives with which this IFSA was started, and now having completed 47 years, in another 3 years, IFSA will be celebrating the Golden Jubilee. So in this journey, we have IFSA has more than 2,000 members, and also there are 11 branches all over India. So in this today's just welcome talk, just I want to tell you my impressions about how this has been achieved by IFSA in this how a bunch of women scientists could achieve to reach out so many people all over India and also carry on so many useful activities. So I joined this IFSA only after my retirement in 2015, and in a way, today's speaker, Dr. Susan Effen, is responsible for my joining IFSA, and she was senior to me in BARC, 5 years senior to me. And those days I always looked upon her as one of the role models, seeing her dedication to the scientific work. Means she was motivating so many young students in BARC, and all this has resulted in recently her achievement. All of you know that Stanford University has made a list of Indian scientists who are among the top 2% world scientists, and Susan's name appears in the category plant and botany. So I take this opportunity to personally congratulate Susan for this achievement. So this I have seen how Susan works tirelessly, whether it is her scientific research or her work for IFSA. And this I have found in among all the IFSA members, starting from the trustees to the executive committee members or subcommittee members, all members, means everyone, our office staff, or all our kind of hostel staff and the persons who take care of the kind of daycare, our persons who help us, means our helpers who maintain the cleanliness of our campus, the security staff, the kind of malis, everyone, right from top to bottom, everyone works with dedication. So that is the secret of success of IFSA. That's what has been my observation all these years. So here I must mention about our founder member, Dr. Sudha Padhyay. She in her 80s now. Even today, she advises us on how to go about achieving certain objectives of IFSA and all. So this is the strength of IFSA. All the senior members give us lot of kind of guidance, which the youngsters can follow. So this is the time when we should means bring in more youngsters to IFSA, so that they carry forward all the uh, uh, means work which was started by the founder members, carrying on today, going on today, and in future also. So if I see this kind of the working model of IFSA, I am reminded of the words, like we often use the words Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti. So this was the Icha Shakti is the desire, no, the willingness to do something for the society. So this was the clear objectives laid down by the founders and all our members. So that desire to carry on those desires, we should have the Jnana Shakti, that is the knowledge. So that is, and today's talk is part of that. We gain knowledge by now, especially in these COVID times, we are holding on so many webinars and scientific talks and other, which will improve our knowledge. So from our Icha Shakti, we move over to the Jnana Shakti, gaining more and more knowledge. And with this knowledge, it will be kind of converted to the Kriya Shakti, that is the implementing all our knowledge for uh, for getting the objectives of for taking forward and taking IFSA to greater heights and all. So this has been my observation about what IFSA is all about. And I take this opportunity to, and I just heard from Lalita and Rita that more and more new members are joining IFSA. That is a very good thing happening. And I will means urge all the new members to visit our website and know about our activities. So that will really motivate them and make them start their own kind of work which is in line with our objectives and all that. So also you can freely download the IFSA newsletter, which gives the reports of all the work that is going on in the headquarters and also in the branches. You will come to know more about, because as I told you, there are 11 branches all over India. So when you go through the newsletters, you will come to know the kind of work going on in other branches and all. And also you will read some very interesting scientific articles which are appearing in the newsletters and all. So these are the kind of my uh, kind of my suggestions to the new members, that please do visit our website and then join hands with us in taking IFSA to greater heights. So with these words, I welcome you all to today's talk by Dr. Susan Eapen, and then I hand over to Ms. Swedel for further conducting the program. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Shamla ma'am, for making us understand the noble work carried out by IFSA and the core values inculcated in every member of this esteemed organization. Now, I would like to introduce our today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Susan Eapen. Professor Susan Eapen is currently an adjunct professor at Biosciences Group, UC College, Aluva, Kerala. A 15th batch BARC training school scientist in biology and radiobiology, she retired in October 2011 as head plant biotechnology and secondary product section at Bhabha Atomic Research Center BARC and Professor Homi Bhabha National Institute HBNI. She had been working at BARC Department of Atomic Energy for more than 39 years and has contributed immensely towards development of plant biotechnology for crop improvement and in vitro secondary metabolites production as well as phytoremediation. She was also involved in the Cotton Mini Mission project of Government of India and is a collaborator for several BRNS funded programs all over India. During one such collaborative project with Tamil Nadu Agricultural University, her team has come out with a high-yielding salt-tolerant rice variety. Incidentally, she has developed the first genetically modified pulse crop way back in 1986. She is considered one of the pioneers in transgenic plant research. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences India, Maharashtra Academy of Sciences, several other associations such as Plant Tissue Culture Association India, Indian Society of Cell Biology, and Society for Genetics and Plant Breeding. She was a member of several committees like Biosafety Committee and Women's Cell BRC, and a member of the Planning Committee of Nehru Science Center. She was a past president and member of the Board of Trustees of the Indian Women Scientists Association and is actively engaged in inculcating scientific temper among student community. As a PhD guide of the University of Mumbai and Homi Bhabha National Institute, she has guided 10 PhD and several MSc students. Professor Susan Epen was until recently the associate editor of international journals In Vitro Plant and BMC Technology, Biotechnology. She has published about 140 papers in national and international journals and has contributed several chapters in books, has presented several papers in national and international symposia, and has trained several international scientists in the field of plant biotechnology. She was invited by the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 2007 to chair a session and give a plenary talk on Symposium in Pollution Ecology. She received Elsevier Award in 2010 for the Best Quoted Paper of the Year. She is a recipient of UNESCO and British Council fellowships and has worked under the Indo-FRG bilateral program in the Free University of Berlin. Her interest varies from plant biotechnology, production of secondary metabolites from in vitro cultures, and phytoremediation. Before we invite our today's speaker, a humble request to all our dear participants for smooth running of the webinar. Please do not click on the present now icon. Post your questions in the chat box. Please mute the audio and switch off the video. It will save the bandwidth. And the use of earphones or headphones for voice clarity is recommended. I now welcome Dr. Susan Epen to our virtual stage to make us aware of the research strategies involved in developing the biomaterials for protection of valuable soil and water bodies. Please enlighten us on your field of expertise. Susan, ma'am.
Can I present now?
Yes. Yes, Susan, ma'am.
Yes, Susan. Window down. Down. Okay. Share. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Seedil. Thank you, Shamla, for the kind words of introduction. Maybe in August, when Vijaya Tilak asked me to talk on a topic, I suggested to speak on crop improvement, which was very close to my heart. But then she said something to do with plants and environment. Then I thought of this topic, and it got postponed due to some reason or the other. So today's talk is on novel strategies for protection and cleaning up of soil and water bodies. Plants, as you know, can be used not only for food, feed, and medicines, but also for protecting our environment. Life on this planet is directly or indirectly dependent on plants for photosynthesis and food production. Plants also release oxygen into the atmosphere, which is absolutely essential for life to survive in this planet. As you know, in the 21st century, there's increased industrialization, urbanization, and anthropogenic activities have enhanced the levels of pollutants in the environment. Hence, effective remediation methods are required for cleaning up all these pollutants. Of course, chemical and physical methods can be used, but they're expensive and environmentally destructive. An alternate method is phytoremediation, which uses plants to remediate pollutants. This is a green technology and it is suitable for developing countries. But several terms like phytoremediation, phytoextraction, etc. Phytoextraction deals with extraction of metals from the solutions or from soil using plants. And rhizofiltration is filtration of metals, mostly from solutions. And phytostabilization is use of plants to stabilize metals or pollutants in particular area, just like acting like a biological green curtain. And phytovolatilization is volatilizing some of the compounds. So this is phytoremediation. Why phytoremediation is important today? Because it is aesthetically pleasing. Everybody likes to see beautiful plants. And for a developing country like us, it is a very cheap method and there is no sound or other sound activities. Workers won't be there to disturb you. But it is a slow method. It's not as fast as a chemical or a physical method. As you know, plants have got extensive root system. The roots are so much that they reach each and every crevice of the soil and it spread to several kilometers underground. You don't see it actually. They are actually solar driven pumps. As you know, pollution is of two types. One is the metal pollution. Metals, metalloids or radionuclides, they come in one group. And the other one is organic pollutants. Now, what's the difference between metals and organic pollutants? Metals can be contained. They cannot degrade them further and further. Whereas in case of organic pollutants, they can be phytodegraded and sometimes even mineralized. There are two types of pollutants, as I said before, organic pollutants and inorganic pollutants. And in organic pollutants, they can be biodegradable or non-biodegradable. And in inorganic pollutants, there are heavy metals, then radionuclides, etc. So phytoremediation approach for organic and inorganic pollutants, both are different because inorganic pollutants can be physically removed from soil or solutions or immobilized, whereas organic pollutants can be degraded. That's the difference between the two. Now let us go to phytoremediation of organic pollutants. As you know, there are so many different types of organic pollutants that we throw out. Many use herbicides to control the weeds. Then we use pesticides to kill insects like chlorpyrifos, lindane, trifluralin, etc. And many of the companies and laboratories, they throw away solvents like TCE, EDB, chloroform, carbon tetrachloride. Never thought what happens to them. Then there are polyaromatic hydrocarbons like anthracene, carcinogenic compounds like benzanthracene, etc. Then the earth is also filled with nitrate esters like GTN, PETN, etc. There are also nitroaromatic explosives like TNT, then RDX, HMX, etc. We also throw PCBs, phenol, and all of us use many drugs, and they are also, like through our excreta, they also come into the soil and solutions. So the plants they grow, they have got extensive root system, and the whole process of metal uptake and degradation of pollutants is a very complex phenomena. There are so many transporters available in the plant for transporting the metals. And in the soil, there's a big rhizosphere. You don't see water there in the soil. there are a lot of microorganisms which there is a lot of interaction between root and microbes, so that metals are released and pH is changed and all that. And once the root absorbs, it has to go into the shoot. So there's a lot of transporters and other genes and the genes involved in all these processes. And then it is transported to the top from the root. Once it is taken up from the soil, from the root, it goes up through the xylem vessels. Then it is sometimes sequestered in the leaves, or it is stored in the vacuoles. So if you look at the organic pollutant or a xenobiotic pollutant, there are three phases. The chemical, that is the pollutant, organic pollutant, is taken up by the cell wall and it enters the plasma membrane. And then the molecule, cytochrome P450 enzyme, is a very important enzyme at this stage. This is in the phase 1 of the organic pollutants. It will convert and it will add functional groups into the particular compound so that it becomes more polar, more water soluble. Then the compound, which is more water soluble, they will enter into the phase 2. Here there is an enzyme called glutathione transferase, which will add some chemicals, add some sugar or peptide molecules into the compound and process it further. So glutathione transferase is very important. So cytochrome 450 is also very important. Then it enters the phase 3. In phase 3, what happens? There are membrane-bound ATP-driven pumps. So they will take the molecule and they will take it into the vacuole. Plants have got vacuoles, whereas like animals don't have vacuoles because they cannot excrete the chemical. So plants store them in the vacuole, or plants will take up the partially degraded pollutant, that xenobiotic pollutant, and it will be bound to the cell membrane. The cell wall is made of, not cell wall is made out of cellulose and lignin and other chemicals. So it will be just bound there. So don't think that if you have a plant growing in a pesticide field, the plant is going, when you wash the plant, you are going to lose all the pesticide from outside. It's not. It is going to be stored in the plant permanently. It will be bound to the cell wall, or it will be stored in the vacuole. And plants don't have very efficient cytochrome P450 enzyme, glutathione transferase enzyme, because there are several other functions with these enzymes. So, okay. Now this is just a cell. This is also called a green liver model. It is representing how xenobiotic compounds are. You can look below. A organic pollutant is taken in and it is modified. It is conjugated to a sugar molecule, and then it is taken up further and it is stored in the, or sequestered in the cell wall, or is taken into the vacuole and stored there. So it is permanently there. It's not going to be to go out by just washing the vegetable. So metals and radionuclides, metals, there are many metals you are familiar with: zinc, copper, cobalt, chromium, manganese, nickel, cadmium, etc. And there are many radionuclides like uranium, thorium, cesium, strontium, plutonium. Then metals and radionuclides, many of the metals are, as you know, they're essential for the growth and development of plants. There are 13 mineral elements which are essential for the growth of plants, like molybdenum, copper, zinc, manganese, iron, boron, chlorine, sulfur, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and we can include perhaps nitrogen also. Anyway, like then this uptake of mineral elements is very selective. The roots have got special transporters to recognize the special metal and take it inside. And when they are taking, the other metals in the soil are discriminated. The roots are directly in contact with soil and can take up these metals. Movement of solutes into the soil, into the roots, is a passive process. You know, the plants, one difference between plants and animals is that plants have got they've got cell walls. whereas animals don't have that type of cell wall, they have only plasma membrane. So primary cell wall consists of a network of cellulose, hemicellulose, and glycoprotein, and they have small pores also. So there's a passive process in which the metal will be taken in, and the plasma membrane, there's another process that is the active transport where ATP is involved. So their selection takes place. And the tonoplast means tonoplast and vacuolar membrane also are involved. So there are two types of metal transport. One is through the apoplast. Apoplast means cell wall to cell wall. The metal is stopped when in the root, when the metal moves from cell wall to cell wall, when it reaches a particular cell called endodermis in the root, because it is suberonized. Suberin is a very thick, long molecule. It stops getting the metal loaded into the xylem vessel. Whereas in symplast, cell to cell movement is through plasmodesmata. So loading at the xylem, then finally translocation to the shoot and sequestration in the shoot cell. So there are two types of metal transport, one passive method and the other one is active method. Then toxic heavy metals, how do they go taken up by roots? Some of the toxic metals like cadmium, they look similar to zinc. So the transporter cannot distinguish between cadmium and zinc. Maybe Shamla can explain. Similar, and sometimes the transporter mistakes it for the essential metal. So transporters having broad specific activity for essential and non-essential metals can at times take non-essential metal also. Example, cadmium. A cadmium transporter can take, a zinc transporter in the plant can take up heavy metal like cadmium also. Then there are a small group of plants reported which can take up high concentrations of metal, like 0.1 to 0.01% of the shoot mass will be filled with these metals like a nickel, like a cadmium, etc. But what are the disadvantages of these plants? They are low biomass plants. They are very small, very tiny, and like you cannot. They are limited in a geographical distribution, but you cannot use it for removing something like that. So you have to have huge plants, candidate plants, which can accumulate metals and other things. So phytoremediation can be improved by using transgenic technology, by transferring genes from these hyperaccumulated plants into our candidate plants. We can improve the uptake mechanism. So there are so many plants which can be used, not genetically transformed, normal plants which can be used. One such plant only I'll deal with today, that is vetiver plants or Vetiveria cycinoides. It's a miracle plant. This is traditionally used in Karnataka, maybe from the 20th century, early 20th century, for environmental conservation, to prevent soil erosion, waste conservation, and wastewater treatment. It's also a source of aromatic soil. This particular plant can grow in drought. It can withstand high temperature, low temperature. It can grow in flooded conditions. It can grow in alkaline conditions. It can grow in acidic conditions. Anywhere it can grow. So we developed, then I am speaking only about a small part of work, maybe 5% of my work, which I did towards my retirement. We developed a tissue culture protocol for producing large number of vetiver plants in the test tube. And we use these uniform plants for uptake of radionuclides, metals, degradation of organic pollutants, etc. So coming to uranium, we thought, since I was working in a Bhabha Atomic Research Center, let me study some use this plant for uptake of uranium. So we did some phytoremediation experiments. Then BRC has got some mill tailing ponds. They extract uranium, and after extraction of uranium, the level of uranium comes down very low. and it is put in many, it is actually in a Jeduguda, we have 3 tailing ponds where a very low concentration of uranium is put in the tailing ponds, and my kilometers and kilometers of areas are spread there, and these are the tailing ponds. So we wanted to see whether these our plants can survive in the effluents of UCIL, so and also in the tailing ponds of Jeduguda. So we did some basic studies, and we found that this plant can even deplete uranium at lower concentrations in the lab. So we studied the different characters of the plants, how the plant behaves to toxicity of uranium after 4 weeks. This is a low concentration. Then we found the roots are growing very well. And we studied the survival of these plants, whether they can be used, whether they can grow in uranium or other solutions, effluents, etc. So we found that they can even survive in the uranium ore, and when it is treated with the citric acid, which will release the uranium, it can even take up high levels. So another compound like ruthenium nitrate, we have grown the plant, and another effluent, UED effluent. Then we also studied the anatomical ultrastructural studies of vetiver plants exposed to uranium. We did even electron microscopy. I'm not showing, this is a leaf control and 1000 ppm uranium, slight changes in the anatomy of the leaf, slight changes in the morphology and anatomy of the root at 1000 ppm of uranium. And one thing is that using this plant, we could extract the uranium from the soil. This is yellow metal. What you see in the flask is extracted by these small plants from solutions containing uranium after acid digestion, of course. So we transferred these plants to the Jeduguda mill tailings and grew in the lab. They were growing quite healthy. They were very happy with the mill tailings. After a long time, still they are healthy. And even after 1.5 years of transplantation in Jeduguda mill tailings, without water also, they can survive. So we wanted to see where it is going, where the uranium is going. So you can see in the first picture, a plant exposed to low concentration of uranium. In the middle, there is control, and then there is a very high concentration of plant exposed to very high concentration of uranium. And just next to that, you can see the autoradiograph of the picture. So the first one corresponds, that is a low concentration. When the concentration of uranium is low, it is accumulated only in the lower portion, in the root portion. And when the concentration of uranium is very high, it goes to the shoot. In the control, you don't see any image in the control in the middle. So we planted these vetiver plants in uranium mill tailing ponds in Jeduguda. So that Jeduguda, we wanted to, people in Jeduguda, they send their cattle to eat, the grass and everything growing in these tailing ponds. They are not used to this. They don't understand, it is some uranium is there. So we wanted to have a biological curtain around the Jeduguda tailing ponds, and also we don't want anybody to come and the animals to come and eat, because they don't normally eat this grass. So we grew it, and by the time I retired. So you can even use bioengineering techniques for the vetiver. You can use actually for cleaning up of soil and the solutions. I have borrowed a few slides from Biosephra Foundation from my friend Pradeep. So he is based in Calcutta. So they have used this plant for a canal eco restoration. I think Sridhuba will be, and Niyati will be familiar with this particular place in Calcutta. They have used this plant for a waterway, cleaning up of waterways in West Bengal. And again, canal eco restoration. So here what they do is they put either jute or coir or bamboo and other materials on the site, and then they plant the vetiver plant. The vetiver plants have grown bigger now. You can see the canal restoration in Calcutta. Water body also can be cleaned with this. what you have to do is, this is a water body which is highly contaminated. So you can make floating gardens on the top of the water bodies. There even penna can be used. There are many plants which can be used, but I am concentrating only on vetiver plant. So you grow these floating gardens in the water bodies which are contaminated, and later they are removed and incinerated. And then you replace with fresh ones. So this is another floating garden. We're using phytoponic solar aeration system developed by that company. So this is another water body restoration in everything, again in Calcutta. Then another one. So this lake I have also visited. I think Patoli Lake was quite dirty in the beginning. Now it has become very beautiful with a fountain and everything, and the water looks very clean and beautiful. So using all these techniques, the lake was cleaned. This is again Patoli rejuvenation in Calcutta. You see the shops around. People come to visit. They feel very happy. Otherwise, this site was not visited earlier. And recently I introduced Pradeep to Mumbai, our Neethi river. It is very highly contaminated, and I am very happy that Pradeep has started working on removing the pollutants. And actually, I think Aditya Thakre also came for inauguration of this program. I hope he picks it up and cleans our Neethi river in Mumbai. So these are some of the other, even canal irrigation, canal embankment stabilization. You can use biomaterials like coir and bamboo and all those things. And these are some of his projects. So you can see the Pradeep standing there after his work. Pradeep is there in canal embankment stabilization. Even I think now he's going to clean up the Ganga with the help of Netherlands, I suppose. You can see the plants growing. Now let me come to transgenic plants. Can we make plants which are more efficient? I told you earlier that the hyperaccumulated plants are very, very tiny, and they grow only for 2 or 3 months. And during that period, even if they accumulate high levels of metals, you cannot use them because they grow only in Europe. Even if you bring them here, they cannot survive also. So can you make some robust transgenic plants which can take up more metals, heavy metals, and which can degrade xenobiotic pollutants? This was the question. So I am not going into any detail. If you are interested, you may refer to any basic biology. A gene can be cloned from an alien source and introduced into a vector, and the foreign gene is introduced into the plant using direct gene transfer by particle gun bombardment or by agrobacterium mediated gene transfer. So in our lab, one of my colleagues, Dr. Mukherjee, I think Rita knows him quite well. He was working on a Trichoderma virens. So we collaborated with him, and the GST gene in Trichoderma virens is very efficient. So we cloned that gene and introduced into a Precambia vector and introduced into agrobacteria and introduced into tobacco plants, and then we use them for studies, and the transformation was confirmed by transient Gus assay 48 hours after transformation. Then other tests like southern blot, etc., carried out to confirm that plants are really transgenic. So after that, we use the transgenic plants for testing. In case of cytochrome P452E1, one gene was cloned from human. The human liver is very good in metabolizing many drugs and all that. So human cytochrome P450 is very efficient. So 2E1 gene was cloned from humans and introduced into tobacco plant, and we tried how the lindane will, how the plant can, whether the plant can degrade lindane, which is a banned pesticide. With the help of Dr. Kale, we used radioactive lindane, C14 lindane, for removal by different tobacco transgenic lines. So some of the transgenic lines with the cytochrome P452E1 gene removed high levels of lindane from hydroponic media. Not only that, we found that the lindane is further degraded by these transgenic plants. So transgenic plants, which is a non-vegetarian plant with a human cytochrome P452E1 gene, showed enhanced uptake of lindane. our studies have shown that linden is further degraded in in the transgenic plant. The second gene was glutathione transferase gene, which was cloned from Trichodoma virens. So this gene was cloned and introduced into tobacco, and the plants were tested for uptake and degradation of anthracene, which is a polyaromatic hydrocarbon. The first one is a control plant grown in presence of anthracene, and the second one is a transgenic plant. Transgenic plant can grow very well, and afterwards we analyzed by mass spec and all that, and we found that the molecule, anthracene molecule, is degraded into smaller molecules. So transgenic tobacco plants expressing a fungal GST gene showed enhanced uptake of anthracene. Anthracene was taken up and degraded into naphthalene derivatives by transgenic plants, while control plants could not degrade anthracene. So you understood why we selected cytochrome P450 and why we selected GST, because they are involved in the phase 1 and phase 2 of organic pollutant degradation. So then also we tried for some metal genes, like we cloned some genes, zinc transporter gene, a copper transporter gene, and a nickel cobalt transporter gene. The top two are from Neurospora crassa, and the third one is from a bacteria. And we developed transgenic plant with a zinc transporter gene from Neurospora crassa, and a copper transporter gene was introduced from Neurospora, cloned and introduced from Neurospora crassa to tobacco. So transgenic plant expressing zinc transporter gene showed enhanced zinc acquisition. It was confirmed by different methods, and it could take up to 11 times zinc compared to control plants. And most of the zinc was located in the roots. So this is a copper transporter gene. Again, copper is an essential micronutrient, but toxic at elevated levels. So we developed transgenic plant with a copper transporter gene, which could remove high levels of copper from solution compared to the control plants. The present studies have shown that transgenic plants with a zinc transporter gene could take up more zinc compared to control. Similarly, transgenic plant with a copper transporter gene could take up more copper. Both zinc and copper are important micronutrients and can even be used for biofortification of food crops as well, because this is like a with two sides of a coin, no? That you can use for improving the status of zinc, because zinc deficiency is a very major problem in India. You can improve zinc concentration in plants using these transporters. You can even use, we also cloned a nickel cobalt transporter from a bacteria, and we tried for removal of cobalt-60 from radioactive, low-level radioactive waste from contaminated soils and water bodies. Nickel cobalt amylase was cloned from R. palustris and introduced into tobacco by Agrobacterium tumefaciens, mediated gene transfer. The transgenic plants could take up more cobalt and zinc compared to the control plant. So these are the plants which are growing, control plant on one side and transform plants growing on cobalt-60 solutions with a low level. But when the plant picks up this cobalt-60, the plants turn yellow. The bottom plants are, transform plants, and top plants are the control plants. Control plants remain green, whereas the plants which take up more cobalt, they become yellowish in color. So transgenic plants were tested for uptake of cobalt-60. So transgenic lines showed up to 2.8 times higher accumulation of cobalt-60 compared to control plants. Most of the cobalt accumulated in the roots with 0.3 to 3% translocation to the shoots. So this is what I wanted to tell. Then I think somebody told me that I must speak something about what came in about the Stanford Award. Actually, I was not even aware that it was a big award. Actually, after 3-4 days only I realized it was a good award. So if you look at the country-wise percentage of bird scientists, you can see that USA occupies 43% of the top 2% of world scientists. Then other places like Canada, Japan, and all that are there. Then India, only 1% of the world's 2% scientists are from India. And how do they calculate this? I just found my name. I did not even look when somebody sent. You can see my name. Then some papers and all they just reported. Maybe because I was a lady. I don't know. How the 2% list is made, the paper and details of a methodology on preparing the list of top 2% scientists in the world, how it is made, it is written here. If somebody is interested, I can send it to them. I myself don't understand because I'm not a information technology person. I don't know how to assess. So assessed on the basis of citation impact during the single calendar year in 2019. So these databases are available, and there are 2 pages. There are some formulas for calculation also. And actually, it is based on the carrier long and single year 2019 impact factor based on citations and separately based on the composite indicator. So Vijayalakshmi Viju may be knowing something about it. I don't know how to calculate all these things, but I somehow was lucky to be in the top 2% even after 9 years of my retirement and no work during the period. So this is a PLOS journal. It actually came in a PLOS biology. This is all I would like to say today. Thank you all. Actually, I have some more thing, but it is not related to this. If you want, I can continue.
Yeah, Susan, please.
No, this is not actually related to this. Okay. So thanks to all. IFSA means a lot to me. Thank you for your valuable support. Okay. You mean so much to me. Now, after coming to this college, there's actually no facilities at all. So what to do? So we thought of developing women hygiene products from an aquatic weed. Aquatic weed called water is actually in Kerala and maybe in many parts of India also. Water hyacinth, a weed of water bodies and lakes of Kerala, interfere with the navigations. You see, Kerala is having lot of water bodies, backwaters, and it interferes with the navigation. Boats cannot move. It just blocks boats. Fishing is also very difficult, and all the aquatic organisms die due to the lack of oxygen. So we wanted to see, this was 2 years back, as soon as I joined, we isolated the fibers from this weed when we wanted to see whether it can be used to develop cheap and eco-friendly women hygiene products like sanitary napkins and panty liners. The first opportunity is that we wanted to clean up the lakes, and the fiber of the weed can be used to produce sanitary napkins for economically weaker sections of women who cannot afford to buy very costly things. So this will open up employment opportunity for women, which will also empower them. Then these hygiene products, especially for weaker sections of women, and actually it's a threat to the environment. People in Kerala, they don't know what to do with this weed. And this particular sanitary napkin is also biodegradable. So we studied the water absorption efficiency of water hyacinth fibers with cotton. So we can see that how much water is absorbed by water hyacinth fibers and how much is absorbed by cotton. Actually, water hyacinth fibers absorb more water compared to cotton. And after irradiation with ultraviolet radiation, it absorbs more water. So what we did was we isolated the fiber, we collected the water hyacinth from the lakes and collected from water bodies. We separated the stalks and washing and slitting longitudinally, then retting and drying, improving absorption of your fibers using radiation. We even tried a gamma radiation that also could improve the absorption capacity of these water hyacinth fibers. So we were thinking at that time we can even micro encapsulate with herbal powders. Then we sterilize the thing with autoclaving and using radiation also we can do that. And testing on animals, all those things we have not done up to now. So this is how it is done. The girls are collecting the material from the lakes which are flooded with the Iconia crassips. It's called Iconia crassips. They separate the stalk and then they either boil it or then they take up the, remove the fibers from that, and then they develop the sanitary napkins. Actually, I had photographs of how much blood it absorbs and all. It was comparable to the Carefree and like other things. Only problem here is that the amount of fiber you get is very low compared to so much of material you have, because it's so much of water inside. So you have to take so many kilos of material to get maybe very less amount of fiber. So we developed the water hyacinth thing, but then we didn't go further. That's all. So whatever is left over from water hyacinth material after taking out the fiber can be converted into manure by composting or using various biodegradable methods. That's it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, that is